Metering modes. My God. You're probably wondering, do I have any other shirts other than this one? It's still got a few videos left, and I do have a lot more shirts. I've got 2 like this actually. Anyway, let's talk about metering. This can be so confusing to many people, and a lot of people just panic and leave it on evaluative or matrix, the easy metering mode. That's often going to work, but it's worth knowing what metering is, because in challenging situations, it can actually be a great help. This is metering. Enjoy. Okay, so what is metering? We know now that your camera sensor takes a light reading of what's in front of it, and through that light reading converts those photons into a voltage, then into code, and into an image. Metering gives you control over where exactly in that frame you want your camera to take a light reading of. So it doesn't have to be the whole frame. You can actually get specific. I want you to take a light reading over that single part of the frame. I still want you to take a picture of the whole frame, but I want you to take a light reading, determine the exposure of the image from that particular spot. That might be a subject, might be something in the background. So let's look at exactly what that means. Unfortunately, every camera brand today has different names for their metering modes. Sometimes the same name for a metering mode, but its functionality is different to another camera brand. So it can get very confusing. We'll look at the main ones now of both Canon and Nikon, and you'll get a good understanding of how metering works. Firstly, the first one in Canon is the evaluative option. What this means is it'll still take a light reading over the whole frame, but it will prioritize what is in focus. It'll give an emphasis, 60% emphasis to what is in focus. So whatever's in focus, which should be your subject, it's going to prioritize giving a light reading and exposing that area correctly. Most beginners, and in fact professionals, leave their metering mode on here because it's going to work 99% of the time unless your light conditions are incredibly difficult. The next one is also a common use and is often left on for beginner photographers, but it's probably not as consistent as evaluative metering. And this is called the center weighted average, which again means it takes our light reading of the whole frame as an emphasis on the center. The problem about this is if your composition puts your subject off center, you might get the wrong reading. The next one is Canon's partial metering. Now this allows you to meter according to your focus point. A smaller area around your focus point, only about 10% of the frame, but it will move with your focus point. It gives you quite a lot of control. So if you want to expose your subject according to a specific setting, it will help you do that because it's only taking a light reading over quite a small area. The last one is spot metering. It's taking a light reading to create an exposure over a very small area, which is your focus point. Now, what's a common mistake is that a lot of people think that that area is only as big as your focal point, which is not entirely true, and people can make mistakes because of it. It's actually just bigger than your focus point. Not a lot, but when your vision is so precise, that knowing that the area is slightly bigger than your focal point can make a difference. Now with Nikon, there's different symbols, different titles, but they pretty much mean the same thing. There's matrix, which takes a light reading over the whole frame. Most of the time that's going to work for you. And then there's center weighted. This is where it gets confusing. It is slightly different to Canon's, although it's called something quite similar. It also takes a light reading over the whole frame, except it has an emphasis on the center or where your focus point is. That emphasis can move around the frame. Usually it's about 60% emphasis on where your focus point is, and then 40% the rest of the frame. Nikon also have a spot metering. These are the two that actually mean the same. Throughout every camera brand, it takes a light reading over a small area, which is your focus point. But remember, not exactly around your focus point, it's just a little bit bigger. Nikon actually have quite an interesting metering mode, which actually does help quite a lot, and it's called the highlight metering, which means it prevents your highlights from blowing out, getting too bright. It's the spot metering icon with a little star next to it, and when you're shooting a scene with strong highlights that you want to retain, you don't want them to get too bright, this is a very effective way of doing it. So that's what the metering modes are, and that's what they mean. I hope that makes sense. You might wonder, why bother? Why bother in all these metering modes? Let's just choose evaluative or center weighted, which is the common ones, which a lot of people do. They leave their camera on it and it works. In a scene where there's a lot of dynamic range, there's a lot of bright areas and a lot of dark areas, and the result of your image isn't coming out the way you want it to, it might just be because of your metering mode. So let's have a look at a few examples. If I were evaluative metering in this case, it would probably work quite well. What's in focus are my tribesmen, and the camera is going to expose that correctly. If I was on spot metering, this could have had quite a negative impact on this image. You'll notice that their skin's quite dark. If my spot had landed on that part of their skin, I'd have had an overexposed image because it's taking a light reading of just that area on the skin. Because it's dark, the whole exposure of the image is going to increase. If that spot moved to the next tribesman who had white paint all over his face, now it's bright. If the spot was just over that tribesman alone, it would see a very bright area in that small space and drop the exposure, making the image very dark. So spot metering could have been troublesome. Again, with these giraffe, now spot metering, such a finite option that if your spot was on one of the dark patches of the giraffe, the camera is going to overexpose the scene too much because it's getting a light reading of a very small place that's entirely dark. It doesn't, you've told it to disregard what's happening in the rest of the frame. If that spot moved over one of the pale stripes between the patches, it would now be very pale. It'll be very bright in that area. So the camera is going to darken the image, possibly too much. So in a scene like this, where there's lots of bright and dark area, there's patterns, evaluative metering or center weighted or matrix is definitely going to work better. And here's another scene with an elephant. The sky is very bright, the foreground's very neutral. It could work quite well for you to have spot metering because you can put your focal point on your elephant where it should be, and you can tell it, I want this elephant to be exposed to a certain amount, and it gives you a level of control. With the clouds changing in the background, if you were on a more broad option like matrix or evaluative, you might get inconsistencies because more clouds can come, shade can come all over the foreground, and exposures can vary. More than likely not too much and not enough to panic about, but it will be slightly different where spot metering will give you an exact exposure every time on your elephant. Another time to use spot metering that might help is when you're facing very harsh light conditions or challenging light conditions. For example, shooting into the sun. There's so much light coming through the lens and so much contrast between some areas, very bright light, very dark light, very dark light, that taking a light reading over the whole frame might confuse your camera, and often does in this situation. You get varying levels of brightness and darkness. Some images are very underexposed, some images are very overexposed, some are good, some are not good. In a situation like this, spot metering might just be your answer, where you can put your spot on your subject and you say, I want that subject to be exposed according to my settings on my camera. According to what my aperture, my ISO, and my shutter speed are, that area around the spot must be exposed that way, and the rest of the frame will fall in accordingly. In a situation like that, spot metering can help. That's metering. I hope it makes sense, and we'll see you for the next one. Cheers.